Welcome to Grounded Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won real-world experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's guest is Benji Backer, and we bring you a conversation we recorded live in October at the University of Wyoming. Benji Backer is an author and environmental activist who has spent his career working to depolarize environmental issues. He authored the best-selling book, The Conservative Environmentalist, and founded the American Conservation Coalition, America's largest right-leaning environmental advocacy group. He recently launched a new nonprofit called Nature is Nonpartisan, which aims to highlight environmental issues Americans agree on and build bipartisan coalitions to address these issues. He has been named to Forbes 30 Under 30, among many other accolades. We discuss his vision for a nonpartisan environmental movement and how he and his friends managed to start a successful nonprofit while they were still in college.
I'm really excited to be sitting here with Benji Backer, who I think really exemplifies both the goals of bridging divides and having conversations and collaborations across difference, but also getting things done in the real world. I think he's done both of those really well. He has tons of accolades and achievements. Among them, he's the founder and executive chairman of the American Conservation Coalition, which I believe is the largest right-of-center climate and environment advocacy group in the country. We're going to talk a lot about all of ACC's accomplishments, so leave it there. He's Forbes 30 Under 30. He's more than 10 years younger than me, which is a little intimidating. And I would say, he's probably way too modest to say this, but I would say he's done more probably than any other single person to start a cross-partisan conversation about environment and climate change in particular. And so we're just so lucky to have you here, Benji. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt. And I mean, I think I speak for myself when I say I believe Wyoming's the future of the conversation that we're about to have today. I actually think, I mean, first of all, Wyoming's my favorite state in the country. That's not even me just saying that. And so it's awesome to be back here and to be at the other UW, because I went to the University of Washington. Some would say in the room, probably the better UW, this one. But, I really appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue. So there's a lot of college campuses that don't really want to have these dialogues right now. And the fact that you're bringing such diverse speakers to campus is really unique amidst a really tumultuous time. And to solve any real problems in this country or around the world, we're going to have these difficult dialogues. And so I actually serve on the board of Bridge USA nationally, and I think what they're doing is incredible. I think what you're doing with this fellowship is incredible. And thank you for being here too, because there's a lot of things going on, and sitting and listening for an hour and a half is not always on the top of the priority list. But we're going to make this fairly interactive too, and so we'll open it up for questions and answers at some point. But my background is that I got active in politics when I was 10 years old. My parents were never active. That's usually the assumption, but I really was inspired by the John McCain, Barack Obama debates, and I felt really inspired by the fact that they respected each other and had camaraderie for having tough dialogues across party lines. My grandpa was a Marine, and so inherently John McCain reminded me of my grandpa, and so I started to look into the different political beliefs on each side. But I ended up feeling more drawn to conservatism and conservative values, specifically on the fiscal issues. By the time I was in high school, I was speaking at CPAC and going on Fox News and speaking on Tea Party tours and stuff like that. And by the end of high school, I realized that my other passion, the environment and energy and climate, just the belief in protecting the planet, seemed to be at odds with my political beliefs.
So not to age you, but what year was this?
This was 2016, so I'm starting to get old. I'm 26 now, so this was 8 years ago, which is actually crazy.
I ask because those of you who have been following the climate conversation know that the polarization of climate has changed a lot, kind of from 5 years to 5 years, starting maybe in the late 80s. Okay, so I want to come back to how you got there,
Sure.
But let's just start, for those in the room who don't know, by talking about where you are now. So the American Conservation Coalition, how many volunteers do you have? How many states are you in? let's just start there.
So we have 55,000 activists across the country, and they're all 50 states. We have over 200 chapters across the country in all 50 states. And of course, there are places where we have more people than others, but it is truly spread out across the entire country. And really, it's 55,000, mostly 18 to 30-year-olds who believe that the environment and climate should be not a partisan issue, and that conservatives need to be at the table for that.
So let's talk about some of your wins. I'm going to prod you on some of the ones that I know about, and there's probably many others that I don't. So some of you may not know this, but one of the largest caucuses right now in the House of Representatives is the Conservative Climate Caucus.
Yep.
It has over 80 members. Is it over 100 now?
Yeah, it's nearing 100.
Nearing 100
Yep.
members. And that was started in 2021 by Representative John Curtis of Utah. And how did he get the idea to do that?
Well, all the best ideas in the world come on hikes. That's my personal belief. And the best idea for this, all intents and purposes, for this example, it came from a hike. So during 2020, I went on a hike with John Curtis. He represents Utah, and he was the mayor of Provo before becoming the congressman for that area. And he represents actually the youngest district in the country because there's so many college campuses in his district. And so he cares a lot about the issue of climate change and the environment, but he's a Republican. So he had actually reached out to me in 2019 to have a phone call about how to build a constituency of members of Congress on the right who cared about this issue. About a year later, we went on this hike in Utah, and when we were getting towards the top, which he was like, he's incredibly fit. It's just really cool. He spends most of his free time outdoors, and so we were bonding over all sorts of things. And when we got to the top, I was like, what if we brought the colleagues that you know who care about this issue together outside of DC? Because everyone in DC, I mean, it truly is a swampland of kind of toxic politics. It is just as bad or worse than people think it is. So how do we get them out of DC and have a conversation in the mountains about how to work on getting the conservative movement active on climate and the environment? 6 months later, or less than 6 months later, it was probably like 4 or 5 months later, we gathered 25 Republican members of Congress in Utah. We literally went on hikes with the members of Congress. It was really, really cool. Got them out of their typical element. And we talked about how to get the Republican Party active on climate. And from that came the formation of the Conservative Climate Caucus. Now, for those of you who aren't political nerds, the caucus is just a group of people in the House of Representatives that cares about a specific topic, or it's like a thematic, basically, working group for members of Congress to talk about everything from, I mean, there's like a ski caucus to really important caucuses, like there's a problem solvers caucus, which is like the most bipartisan members who actually are trying to solve problems, not like the Marjorie Taylor Greens and AOCs. So that's kind of, this caucus was formed out of that, and now there's almost 100 Republicans. And so when we were starting this organization in 2016, 17, there were 2 Republicans in Congress who acknowledged that climate change was real and that we needed to do something about it. And now they're, between the House and the Senate, are 150.
That's great. And so what does membership in this caucus constitute?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just, so the basic premise is that you believe climate change is real and you want to do something about it, and it's an educational caucus. So they're traveling around the country and around the world to look at solutions in different areas. So they've actually been out in Wyoming to see different carbon capture facilities, next generation nuclear facilities. They've been overseas. They've been in Iceland to go see geothermal. I mean, they've been all over the world, and they go together. And then from there, they tend to figure out, okay, well, this specific issue area around climate is relevant to my district. And so I'm going to work with these other members of Congress to introduce a bill. And so even though we don't hear about it, there have been a lot of bipartisan policies passed from these caucus members over the last 4 to 5 years. And it's all because of the fact that they actually have like a convening mechanism. So the caucus itself doesn't produce policy. It's just an educational caucus, but it produces education, but it also produces camaraderie. And they have like fellow friends that care about this topic that they know they can lean on if they introduce something.
So let's talk a little bit about some of these bills. So there are, I would divide them into maybe 3 flavors. There's ones that are directly energy and climate related, like say the Chips and Science Act, which was quite one. Ones that are climate adjacent, even not explicitly climate related. Wildfire Caucus.
Yep.
Then there are some that are climate related, tacked on to something else, kind of something else tacked on to climate. So an example of that might be the new permitting reform
Yep.
by our Senator John Barrasso and Joe Manchin. And then there was an agricultural one, wasn't there, that had climate in the title?
Growing Climate Solutions Act, yeah.
Say that again slowly.
Growing Climate Solutions Act, which so that basically basically allowed farmers to receive extra income and extra change in their pocket if they were reducing emissions on their property. And the USDA would track it for them, so it wasn't like adding any work. It basically was like, if you're going to use more efficient agriculture methods, or you're going to do some sort of natural carbon capture, use more efficient technologies, we will give you a tax incentive and income incentive for, instead of like punishing these farmers, actually aiding them in their efforts to decarbonize or lower their carbon impact. That's the sort of policy that we tend to push, and that's what tends to be bipartisan and nonpartisan, is just kind of something that everyone gets a win from. When farmers are lowering emissions on their property, you can care about climate change, and that's great because you're lowering carbon emissions. You can care about the livelihoods of farmers. That can be the reason that you engage on it, because farmers are benefited by it. You can care about food production and crops, and you have more efficient production because they're using more efficient methods. Like, you can care about the topic for different reasons, and you can care about it from an urban kind of liberal perspective or a more rural conservative perspective, to oversimplify, and both sides win. And I think in America, we've lost that ability to make policy based off of things that win, at least have some sort of win for everyone in the United States. Like in the 1980s and 90s, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan worked with Democrats to pass the most robust environmental policies of all time. And at the time, the environment was seen as a nonpartisan issue. Over 80% of Americans identified as environmentalists. That is totally different today. And the reason why these policies have worked is because, just like in the 1980s and 90s, we're marrying both sides' priorities and giving everyone some sort of win. And it's not like everyone gets everything they want, right? That's not possible in politics. We're showing them that it's possible to protect the environment, to protect people's communities, to protect people's livelihoods, to protect America. All these things can go hand in hand. And that's how those things have been able to get done.
I want to talk about two more accomplishments. Then I want to wind back the clock.
Sure.
And then at the end, I want to get into some of these tensions, within the Republican Party, within climate politics in general, and then we can go to audience Q&A. So at the August Republican primary debate about a year ago, there was a question about climate change.
Yeah.
From a young man who was identified as a member of Young Americans for Freedom.
Yep.
But he was also a member of ACC, was he not?
Yeah. So
Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah. So Young Americans for Freedom sponsored the first presidential debate that the Republicans had, and it was in Milwaukee where they were going to hold the convention. So there was a lot of eyes on this event because at the time it wasn't a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump would win the nomination. And I think it was one of the first questions, if it wasn't the first question. It was up there, and it was the only question that was asked by a student, which Young Americans for Freedom is a student organization, and that was the one question that was asked. And we didn't to have that be the only question, but we did work to make sure that we got a question in the debate. And the question was, I'm a young conservative, I care about climate change, what are you guys going to do about it? And it was the first time, at least in my lifetime, that at a Republican primary debate that any question similar to that had been asked. And I think it's really unique because it was from a younger person's perspective that it was asked, and the answers weren't necessarily the best. But that's what we're trying to work on.
Okay, we'll come back to that. So now let's go back. You're in college, and you tweet something that starts you on this path.
Usually tweeting something in college isn't a great thing, but it was during class as well, which is in a room not so different than this one.
Blissfully, Twitter either didn't exist or wasn't relevant when I was in college. So what did you tweet and why?
So I was actually, like most college students, well, maybe I'm just projecting, not really paying attention during class. And I was watching the Trump-Clinton debate because I was going to the University of Washington. And so my class is in the afternoon. On the East Coast, like the debate was going on. And so I was in class watching this debate, and I just I thought Hillary Clinton's view on the environment sucked, and I thought Donald Trump's view on the environment sucked.
What sucked about them?
Well, Hillary Clinton was basically saying the world's going to end. Donald Trump, you don't have a plan for this, and we need to, basically ban fossil fuels and get rid of, American energy, basically, and switch all to renewables. And if we don't do that, this crisis is going to take all of our lives. I'm over dramatizing it, but that was basically the message. And then Donald Trump was like, this is a hoax, and there's nothing we need to do about it, and we just need to drill, baby, drill, and any renewable energy sucks, and any clean energy sucks. And I just was like, okay, well, neither one of those are very appealing to me as a young person. I opened up a different tab, and I tweeted out, hey, I'm going to start this organization to get conservatives active on the environment. Does anyone want to join me? And a lot of the people who responded to that tweet at the time are still on the team today. And that was 8 years ago, probably this month that I tweeted that. And what was really unique about that experience was that, like, I had no goal to, like, start, like, a huge organization. I didn't know if it was gonna be like a blog or like just an online Twitter presence, like some sort of social media thing. But it really just transpired into ACC's kind of 55,000 person network, and I worked on it for the rest of college.
Okay,
I was
let's back up a little bit. So you send this tweet out.
Yep.
Some people respond. I imagine you connect with some of the enthusiastic ones.
We did a freeconferencecall.com conference call with a bunch of random people. Like, no one ever knew each other before this. It was kind of a bizarre thing, but we just became like this impromptu team.
And so what was you said you didn't know if you wanted to be a blog, if you wanted to be an org, what you wanted to be. What was your strategy?
I didn't have a strategy.
What did you do?
So basically, I was going to college, and so I had no intention on starting some sort of like national organization right from the get-go of being in college. I was in a fraternity, and I was just like, living a normal college life. And we basically just kept having meeting after meeting and trying to think through, like, what would actually get conservatives to care really quickly? What would be the quickest thing we could do to get conservatives to care about this issue? We had no organization, we had no funding, we had no, like, structure, right? Like, everyone had, like, just random titles, and I gave everyone random titles because everyone needed to, like, have some sort of job to do, but there was, like, no, wherewithal about this, and we didn't have a board, we didn't have any of this.
Okay, so you're trying to pinpoint what will get conservatives engaged in this issue
the quickest. Because we didn't have any money or anything like that. So
what was your answer?
So the answer was every state at the time had a college Republican state chairperson that was elected by the different clubs in the state. And I basically our team got 46 of the 50, I believe, of the college Republican state chair people to say clean energy and climate are important to us, and we want you to do something about it. And that was free. Like, we just had to find the contact information for all these chair people, call them up, and just took a lot of time. But I think about 4 months after we launched, we got that, and then CNBC covered it, and then from there we were kind of off to the races. And then at the same time, I was surrounding myself with a bunch of mentors, and people were helping me figure out, like, how to actually structure the thing.
Okay, that's great, and I don't want to skip over some of those details because they're important.
Yeah.
And particularly, there's some students here from the College of Business, some others who are maybe environmentalists themselves, maybe aspire to do some version, of what you're doing. So my first question is, in reaching out to these college Republican chairs, you mentioned that when you were in high school, active in Republican politics.
Yeah.
Did that give you, like, specific contacts or specific know-how, or just kind of give you the confidence that, like, I know these people, I can talk to them?
I think it was the confidence that I had some sort of like, I had some credibility. Like, you could look me up and you could find that I was, like, a legitimate person.
Like, actually a Republican.
Well, yeah, but or
Canadian plant.
Right. Some hidden,
Canadian, by the way.
Right, which we don't hate you for, but we do dislike you for it. Just kidding. That's really mean. But yeah, so it was just more like they could realize that it was some, like, legitimate task, right? Like, hey, I'm running this thing, and we want you to, sign on to this pledge, basically. it's not like you couldn't find any information about me. 'Cause I mean, I don't know about you, but anytime somebody reaches out, especially randomly, like you should probably like vet that, And so like I knew that I had some sort of reputation enough where people would say, okay, this is a legitimate ask, and it's not just some like trolling and like fake accounts were way less of a thing then than they are now, but it still was like a real problem.
It helps you have a memorable and somewhat unique name. I think I'm at most the third most famous Matt Burgess who works on climate. There's a high-level climate denier in New Zealand and a Wired columnist in the United Kingdom. So
that is, yeah. I think I'm the only Benji Backer out there, but I mean, my name, you just can't start to read the comments of YouTube things because it's like,
Sure.
Why the hell would your parents name you a dog name? That's a dog name. But my full name's Benjamin, so they should just get a grip. But
well, my apologies on behalf of them.
Also, dogs are, it's all Canadian trolls, actually.
Apologize for things that we didn't do. Mostly you guys.
Maybe it's you that's been behind all this.
Moving back to the topic. So two questions. You got that 46 of the 50 chairs to sign on to that. Now, certainly the polls show, at least now, I wasn't following them back in 2016, that young Republicans and moderate Republicans, by clear majorities, do believe in and care about climate change.
Right.
Did you?
I didn't know that.
You did. So
I didn't know that based on data. I just had like a gut feeling based on anecdotal evidence. Now, I did live in Seattle, which is like, I grew up in Wisconsin for reference. But I only like blue states, obviously. So I grew up in Wisconsin, and my conservative peers there and liberal peers felt like it shouldn't be a partisan issue. So I had anecdotal evidence there. And then in Seattle, like the one conservative in the entire city that I talked to also felt that way. No, there's probably at least 3. So like I had the anecdotal evidence, and then I just like I couldn't fathom that young people like wouldn't care about the environment or climate change. Like, we learn about it all the time in schools. If you have social media, it's in your feeds all the time. And so I just had a gut feeling about that. And then when I, of course, when I tweet this thing out and then tons of people respond and they're all like conservative activists, I was like, okay, well, there's got to be something to this. But yeah, I don't think even at the time the data had really come out yet. The data that I had found was that Republicans didn't believe in climate change because they felt like, so there was a Duke University study in 2014 that said that like 40% of Republicans believed in climate change at the time, but when they were presented with a policy agenda that was not liberal, the belief in climate change doubled to almost 80%. So that's the only data point that I had seen. So I'm like, okay, if that's true for just conservatives in general, then younger conservatives must care.
This speaks to motivated reasoning, identity-based beliefs, and maybe something else that's related that speaks to your opening is like, if you had to explain to a Martian why does climate change opinion correlate so strongly with abortion opinion, what do those two issues have to do with each other? And I could have picked many other examples besides abortion.
You want to do one of the safe ones.
Exactly. But we have these partisan identities that are very strong. There's some research a lot of research actually that finds that our partisan identities are more strong now in terms of animosity towards outgroup, unwillingness to let our children marry the outgroup, for example, discrimination than any other identity, much stronger than race, much stronger than religion. And so it tied up with these beliefs. So did you find that some of the people, like, I imagine some of the people that responded were people who were conservatives who cared about climate, who didn't want to believe that it's a Chinese hoax is the best that we can do. But were there maybe others who cared about climate but really didn't want to let go of some of their unrelated issue beliefs that were deeply conservative?
Yeah, but I also think there was a response too that was really inspiring that was from people on the political left. So like in Seattle, like when I told somebody that I was conservative, you kind of like saw that they'd be like, okay, like get ready to put the walls up. And then when you're like, yeah, but I care about the environment, they're like, huh, like that's really fascinating. We care about the same thing. And like we might have a different way of getting there, but we care about the same thing. So I saw that response, and then I saw like the college Republican state chair people who are probably largely more even conservative than I was at the time because I wasn't a huge Trump fan at the time. That and I was kind of open about that. So they were willing to work on this, even though we probably had difference in opinion on other conservative related things, because this was that important to them. And I think that really showed me that there was going to be sort of this path towards where we are now. And it's definitely not been perfect. It's been really difficult. And there's, we've gotten attacked by, so many different powers that be that are, not interested in solving problems, in my opinion. They're interested in just having the status quo continue and having partisanship rule the day. But
Because you're rhinos and greenwashers.
right, yeah, I'm the fossil fuel lover that's bought out by clean energy or whatever. It's just very confusing trying to figure out what my identity is based on the attacks that I get. But no, there are people who didn't want that, but you could see the path, right? You could see the 80% of people who are responding like, oh my God, on both sides, who are just excited about it.
So you got 46 of these chairs to sign on. You get covered by CNBC. It blows up. And then you said something really important, which I want to dwell on for a second, because I think this is important for people listening. You surrounded yourself with mentors. To the extent that you can tell us, who were they and how did you pick them? How did you find them?
Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect way to find these people, but like, especially being in college, it was so easy to find mentors because you have so many professors and people, alumni that wanted to help out. Um, Fraternity alumni, university alumni, professors. There are so many people who wanted to help, and then of course they have connections too, right? Like, I would go to a professor and tell them, "Hey, I'm trying to do this thing," and they'd be like, "Oh, you should meet this person and this person and this person." So that was really helpful. But I also started cold calling and cold emailing a bunch of like really influential people. And at the time, they were just like, "Who the heck is this like 19-year-old that's reaching out to me?" And
Did you get a lot of responses?
no, I got like 1 out of 100, but I got 1 out of 100. And so like Ross Perot Jr., if that name rings a bell, his dad ran for president, and he's a very successful businessman in Texas. He told me he'd meet with me, and so I raised enough money to go and meet him. And he was just like, "Yeah, I've just never had a 19-year-old ever email me." But he was like one of those 1 out of 100, and so then the credibility started building with people like that because they would be interested in having their colleagues sit down with me as well. But then also the news media stuff helped get the credibility too, because if I was reaching out to somebody who I wanted to be a mentor, I could say, like, this is actually like something that, it's not huge, but it's at least starting to get in some momentum and some coverage. But I mean, I had everyone from professors to random business leaders in the Seattle area where I was living at the time. It was mostly local, mentors in the and people who wanted a young person from probably their, university that they went to succeed.
And I imagine this is actually one of the things that I think is really hopeful about the issue of climate change is that you have this natural incentive for both sides to come to the table. So I imagine you heard from liberals who thought to themselves, well, I want to change the whole society. That
Right.
includes Arkansas,
Right.
That includes
Right.
Wyoming, that includes Texas. You're not just going to get that done with the AOC wing of the Democratic Party,
Right.
even if it was true that they had all the good ideas.
And actually, that was, Seattle doesn't have a lot of conservatives, so that was definitely true. Almost all of my mentors were in the Seattle area were like left of center people who, I probably didn't agree with on a whole host of issues, but they knew that you couldn't solve a complex problem like this without, the other side of the aisle. And that was really, an inspiring thing.
And the people you've worked with are not, this is the other achievement that I meant to mention earlier, they're not just politicians.
Yeah.
I mean, I went to your summit in Utah. Was that 1 year ago or 2 years ago?
About a year and a half ago.
About a year and a half ago. And you guys had like Olympic snowboarders.
Yeah.
And Miss America gave a talk, right?
Yep. We've had like
business leaders
actresses and actors. We've had Democrat, Republican members of Congress, mayors, governors, those sorts of people. But it's all sports stars. We've had like different sustainability leaders in sports. And yeah, it's not just politicians. And I think, where it's honestly easier to get the non-politicians to show up because they don't have to, worry about getting primaried for showing up to, like on the right, people don't want to show up because they're like, there's a certain group of people that don't want them to associate with this issue because they see it as a liberal issue. And then people on the left don't want to show up because they don't want to be seen as working across the aisle. It's part of what's wrong with American politics right now, is that we like can't do that. But like these actors or actresses or pro sports people, like, they might vote one way or the other, but they don't really care about showing up to work across the aisle, or maybe it is their own aisle, to solve problems. And a lot of our best allies are outside of politics, and then we use those voices for leveraging this issue.
Protect Our Winters is a really interesting example of a group that seems closely tied and supportive of what you do and relevant to this region, right? They're basically a group who's worried about skiing in a warming world where there's less snow. Right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, and Protect Our Winters, I mean, if you go skiing, you might see their stickers on different signs or whatever, and it's a pretty self-explanatory organization, Protecting Our Winters, but they have athletes from across the political spectrum who are, Olympic gold medalists or just really influential leaders in the outdoor space. And we've leveraged those people with politicians because they'll come back from the Olympics and they'll win gold, and then they'll go meet with a member of Congress or something, and the member of Congress, of course, loves that. If you have any American pride on either side, you're going to be like excited to meet with somebody who's just in the Olympics. And so they tend to skew the other way politically, but we find a lot of common ground over this issue, and we end up supporting each other with a lot of those efforts. And there's so many organizations like that out there that just don't get the same amount of coverage as the people who are gluing themselves to streets and throwing them at paintings and all the stuff that I don't do.
Now, so you got a lot of support from liberals who understand that we need everybody to solve society-wide problems. You've got some support from conservatives who care deeply about this issue but don't want to be liberals. How have you handled, I imagine you've had some want to engage with you more disingenuously too, and push back if this is wrong. But I would guess that if I was running a conservative climate organization, that I might get engagement from people who don't really want to solve climate change, but want to greenwash, right? That's
right.
one criticism. But maybe also you might get people from the other side who want to pretend that they're working across the aisle but have no intention of actually doing so. Did you encounter either of these types?
Yeah, it's still a problem. I mean, there's just so many disingenuous people in politics, and I don't think that's unique for my, our area of work.
How do you suss out who to work with and who not to work with?
I do think, like, you can for me, I can read people. This is going to sound like kind of woo-woo, but I actually mean it. I can sometimes read people's energy in a way. Like, I feel like I can see if people have good intentions, and to me, it's kind of clear with the way you carry yourself if you're faking it or not. But obviously, that's like a really dumb thing to trust. So I have other ways of doing it, but that's kind of like the first test. I would say people's track record is important, right? So if these are leaders who are just suddenly changing, I kind of start with the distrust, right? And not in I won't meet with you way or I won't talk to you way, but just kind of I'm gonna keep it a 10-foot distance and try to give you a chance, and then probably look the person up later or look the organization up later. If they email me, look them up before we even meet. But I would say the majority of the people who are that try to work with me and ACC and in this space are really well intentioned, and they're just thankful that there's something out there that they can work with on this side of the aisle, or if they are on this side of the aisle, that they can work within their own aisle. But the people who are disingenuous tend to have track records of being disingenuous. And there was a debate that I was supposed to do in South Dakota with some prominent climate skeptics and deniers, and I mean, they basically acted like they were gonna have this really cordial conversation, and they ended up basically surrounding me with all the people who disagreed with me to try to show me as this really horrible person. And they had done all this research and digging into my past to find things that they thought were bad, which there wasn't really anything, but they tried to come up with something. And so that was a good learning lesson for me not to do that again. But I would say that's really rare. That I probably could have figured out, but I also like really difficult situations, and so I probably would have done it anyways. And I told you, I hope during Q&A tonight, people ask the toughest questions. Like I want to be put in that. So I don't mind being roasted or grilled, but
I'm writing them down now.
Yeah. Really, yeah. But there's I would say it's rare that is the case, and most well-intentioned people want to surround themselves with well-intentioned people, and so there tend to just be a lot of great people in the space.
Okay, so let's transition to talking about some of the tensions.
Yeah.
Right. So it sounds like you started out with the goal of putting climate change on the agenda in the Republican Party, and standing somewhat above the fray as a moderate non-voting Canadian, I would say that you've largely succeeded. Right. The Conservative Climate Caucus, some of those think tanks that maybe were involved in your South Dakota event are bleeding employees and money.
They're screaming.
It's an issue that people don't want to deny in presidential debates anymore. Got prominent conservative politicians who might say have a base that's on the right side of the party, but are still, if not talking about it, acting on climate change.
Yep.
So a good example of this, I think, is Governor DeSantis in Florida, who's made big investments in the conservation corridor, mangrove restoration, block drilling in the Everglades, does a lot of stuff around disaster preparedness.
He banned he did a bill that would have banned rooftop solar from being monopolized, and basically it would have made it impossible to do rooftop solar in Florida, and he vetoed that.
Our governor here in Wyoming is an interesting example, right?
I think he's the best governor in the country on this topic.
Republican, depending on the polls you look at, I believe he either is the most popular or second most popular governor in the country by approval rating. This is one of the reddest states in the country, second most fossil dependent state in the country, and yet he's been quite supportive of clean energy, of nuclear, of minerals, of carbon
wind,
capture.
everything.
I believe I've heard him talk about net zero at least once.
Oh yeah,
publicly.
yeah, yep.
Okay, so you put it on the agenda.
Yeah, it's much more normalized now, which is great.
But there still is this tension about this issue within the Republican Party, partly related to the fact that there is a fraction of the voters that don't believe in the issue. Partly also maybe because the culture wars and just general polarization have gotten so high that sometimes it's hard to talk about climate solutions without it seeming like a larger part of what people perceive as a problem.
Yeah.
Now they want to take away our gas stoves. They want to take away our hamburgers. And
as we talked about during lunch today, I do not want to take away the hamburgers.
So where
isn't that right?
So where do we go from here? You put it on the agenda. How do we work to mend fences, maybe within the Republican Party, and then we'll talk about, across.
Yeah, I mean, we all know in this room, it's like it's very obvious that, so I titled my book "The Conservative Environmentalist" because I wanted it to seem like a contradiction, because it's not. And so when environmentalists, in the way that we think about that, see the title of the book, they probably want to puke, because they're like, there's no way that a conservative should be writing a book about this. And then every conservative probably also kind of wants to puke that has this negative association with environmentalism. And that's kind of the goal, but it also speaks to the problem, right? Like that still culturally, it's like, if I tell somebody that I'm a conservative climate activist, they have all these assumptions about me, right?
What are those?
Well, they started to assume that I'm sexist, racist, homophobic.
Because you're conservative.
Right. They all these things that are definitely not true. And then on the flip side, if I say that I'm a climate change activist, I mean, conservatives have all these assumptions too, like that I'm trying to take hamburgers away, or that I don't want to, have people fly or grow food or whatever it is, have fossil fuels. And so I basically feel like, there's this stereotype for our organization, for the whole country, for all these words, right? It's almost like a communications language game at this point. But unfortunately, every word, for the most part, has a negative association with it, which is really a weird place to be. And what I think has to change before we really get the progress that we need. Before we get so Mark Gordon, what's great about what he does, and Democrats support him on this. So if you're a Democrat in this room or a Republican in this room, like, it's really important to know that, like, Democrats in the House and Senate here work with him, at least on this issue. I don't know enough about him on other issues, but on this issue, they work with him on it, and Republicans support him on it because it is not taboo to do it here, because people want energy production, they want their communities to develop, they want the state to thrive, they want to have reliable, affordable energy, they want it to be as clean as possible. And if you are doing some sort of cool business in the state, you're welcome here in Wyoming. Whether that's if you're going to build the biggest wind facility in the United States, or you're going to do carbon capture, or if you're Bill Gates trying to help a town 4 hours west of here, Kemmerer, Wyoming, which was basically going to die out because their coal plant was going to get shut down, and replace those jobs with a nuclear facility. So he's kind of struck this amazing balance. But I think in other states it's harder because the culture wars are so much more prevalent in states like Florida, California, New York, etc. I think he's a model. But the way to get to that model nationally is to take this issue out of the culture wars. And so, as imperfect as it is, going around the country, this is my 25th city in 30 days. Like, it's really trying to socialize the fact that this is possible, right? And that you can be a conservative or liberal environmentalist, that you can be an environmentalist and be liberal or conservative, and that we have to work together towards sensible solutions that are in the middle. Like, you can't take away people's energy reliability, and you can't not care about climate change. And that if you're on the right, you have a reason to be skeptical of climate change activists. What you've seen is radical, and what you've seen is not good for your community, most likely. But that doesn't mean that you can't care about climate change and have rational solutions.
Be specific here. So what are you talking about when you say what you've seen is extreme? Are you talking about, soup throwing, harassing commuters? What are you talking about?
Also, like, the Green New Deal. It's I talk about in the book, and like, it's a $93 trillion plan. It's what most people think of when they think of a climate agenda. $93 trillion. It's only solar and wind focused. It's telling people they have to drive EVs. It's telling people that, we got to stop eating meat and stop flying on airplanes. And then, John Kerry and AOC and all these people are flying around in their, planes. And the farmer that's supposed to, feed them with the resources that they have is driving around in a truck that has way less emissions than this hypocrisy. And so there's just like all this. There's a fear that the policy is going to take away their livelihoods. Which is somewhat fair, and then there's a reality that there's a lot of hypocrisy, and so that's what one side is seeing. But I also want to say, like, when I'm also trying to show climate change activists that there are well-intended conservatives out there who aren't just trying to pick that fossil fuels are the only option for the future, and that, like, you can be conservative and be pro-climate. And climate change activists and climate change believers need to realize that too. So really fixing the cultural divide is really important. And the last thing I'll say on this is that in the 1990s, the environment was seen as a nonpartisan issue, and energy and climate were seen as a nonpartisan issue. That's why it was nonpartisan. That's why bills got passed in a nonpartisan way. We cannot make progress on these important topics that have so much more of an implication than just climate change. It has to do with energy reliability, national security, so many different things, if it's caught up in the partisan culture wars. So that's why my next phase of this work is going to be focused on destigmatizing this issue and making sure that these issues are associated with neither party again, because these issues should be nonpartisan, and they were before, and they can be again.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but first, as a segue into it, I want to break this bridging the divide piece into short term and long term.
Yeah.
Because one of the things, as much as the culture wars have gotten worse in the last 20 years, the economics of renewables have gotten so much better, right? And so think about the United States, say, in the next 5 to 10 years in the global context. The approaches like Governor Gordon's, not both being unifying, but also maybe not having some of the tensions that we might have in 50 or 60 years.
Yep.
U.S. emissions have been falling since about 2005. In case that, and as far as I understand it, there's basically 3 reasons for that. It's energy efficiency, renewables, and fracking natural gas replacing coal.
Mostly that.
I've seen different estimates that
Yeah.
have different slices, but those three things are important. We still have, I believe, more than half of primary energy in China on coal. So if you are a huge oil and natural gas producer, which the United States is, I believe we're the largest exporter now in the world. You can tell a story. All of the above, works as a story, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. We can help the world get off of the dirtiest forms of energy, and our fossil fuels are part of that. We can keep energy cheap. Our innovators can develop the world-leading clean technologies that then we get to export all over the world, right? And that's easy to tie to ideas of American exceptionalism and American greatness. So that all works in 5 to 10 years, barring a very large scale of direct air capture. We're sucking carbon out of the air at a large scale, which there's a debate about whether or not that's possible in the next 2 decades. Getting to net zero does involve drastically reducing global reliance on fossil fuels, does it not?
I would say that it does, but specifically coal. Like, there's so many more efficiencies that you can do around natural gas regarding limiting methane emissions, and also the fact that natural gas is half the emissions of coal. The reason why emissions are skyrocketing in India and China is largely because of coal. And if you could half that just by that transition over the next 5 to 10 years, that would be absolutely incredible and help us, avert a lot of the large scale damages. The thing that we have to be conscious of is that, sure, in the next 30 years, transitioning away from our dependency on fossil fuels is important to reducing emissions to the levels that we want to. But we also can't do that at the expense of people's livelihoods. And I think that's the first priority, is that people need affordable and reliable energy. And around the world right now, fossil fuels are that best option for so many places, and it's the most, again, not just affordable but also reliable. 24 solar and wind are not 24/7, and that's why I'm so excited about the potential of nuclear and geothermal, is because they have that 24/7 reliability, and they have the capacity to create high-paying jobs and boost communities in a way that right now solar and wind are not necessarily capable of. That could change, but we don't know if that's even possible at this point. And so, what we have to be fearful of is like saying what you just said, which is like, okay, but we have to decrease our dependence on fossil fuels. The energy, the IEA expects fossil fuel demand to increase over the next decade, and the United States is going to continue increasing its fossil fuel production. That's because the demand is there. And until there's not demand for fossil fuels, because something else can replace it as affordable and reliable as fossil fuels aren't going to go away. And that's just a reality that we have to accept, is that we have to balance the need for affordable and reliable energy with protecting the environment, because our livelihoods, and like, especially in developing countries, there's a reason why China's doing coal production. It's because right now that's the most efficient, cost-wise thing for them to do for how much they're producing in terms of mining and manufacturing. And even in the state of Arizona, which I live now, they're building data centers all over the state for AI, and they don't have enough energy, and they're not looking to solar and wind. They're looking to coal and natural gas. And so that's a real balance that we have to strike. And so I don't know how we get to 2050 without decreasing or without increasing fossil fuels. I want to avoid that scenario. But if we're going to avoid it, we have to do it in a way that makes sense economically and humanitarily, if that's a word. It's not a word, but
In a humanitarian way.
in a humanitarian way. But the thing is that we don't need to have all the answers right now. Like, it's 2024, and yes, we have a mountain to climb in terms of trying to decrease carbon emissions while energy demand is going up. That is a mountain to climb. We're taking the steps in the direction towards that, and I don't think we have all the answers right now, but that's okay, because we're going to come up with them. There's going to be brilliant new ideas from innovators and entrepreneurs across the world, whether that's creating a brand new energy source, or whether that's putting whale poop in the ocean because that sucks up carbon. Like that's actually a real thing. Or it's nuclear, next generation nuclear takes off. Or there's so many different things that can happen, and I think we just got to keep moving in that.
I want to steelman. I'm a generally very optimistic guy, but I want to steelman pessimism for a second because I think it's critical to bridging the right-left divide.
Sure.
Right on this issue. And let's stay 1,000 feet up. Like we could debate, the economics of solar and wind.
No one wants to hear that. Right? That's for later.
I would say are pretty good, but anyway. But here I think is the key point that I think gets where some of the left-right divide gets hung up on this issue, right? So on the one hand, I think you see conservatives who sometimes look at liberals talking about how we need to change our whole economic system, and yes, you should stop flying and you should stop eating your hamburger. And, capitalism is the problem. You see Greta Thunberg wearing a keffiyeh at Eurovision protesting Israel's participation. And you're like, what does this have to do with climate? And so I think it's easy to look at examples of progressive activism and say, they want to change our lives in ways we don't want to, and maybe climate change is kind of
their vehicle,
the latest excuse, right?
To push, that is the way that people see
agenda. Okay, and probably there are some on the left who are operating that way.
Not most, though.
But there I think with climate change, there are also some who really believe that we can't stop warming without getting to net zero. That's just physics, right? And we're not going to be able to capture enough carbon to do so without getting off or really close to getting off fossil fuels. And depending on what you think the consequences are of 2 degrees versus 3 degrees, but you think that we need to figure out how to do that, by, some people say by 2050. Personally, realistic would be kind of later in the century in terms of what's likely to happen as opposed to what's good or bad. But I guess the point I'm trying to get at here is the people who are saying we need to change all of society sincerely and we need to do so quickly, they're basically making an empirical claim, right? Which might be right or might be wrong. But
it's a dangerous claim, though, because when you rush decisions around people's energy, which is what our livelihoods depend on to survive, you are making dangerous decisions for humanity in the process of that. So, like, California is a very minor example of this, but it's having major ramifications where they're trying to rapidly decrease their fossil fuel production in the state. Energy prices are double that of the national average now. Their emissions actually aren't going down really because they're importing fossil fuels from all over the world instead of doing nuclear and natural gas in their own state. And they rushed that decision, and it is having massive negative ramifications on the poorest people in their state. And their state cannot afford to keep doing the things that they're doing. Arizona, where I live, a decent percentage of the power that we generate gets sent to California every single day. 80% of a coal plant that I toured in Utah of their power gets sent to California every single night. When you rush the decisions around fossil fuels, end up, it's backfiring because there's no way that, importing fossil fuels from other countries and coal from Utah is more carbon efficient than doing it in your own state with natural gas or nuclear. So it's not even pro-environment, but B, it's really bad for the state because you've just lost all those jobs and now energy is more expensive. So you're like rushing this decision for some 2030, 2050 goal, but you're doing it in a way that actually ends up hurting people more than any effects of climate change ever would. And that's a realization that I had to come to. I used to think it was as easy as turning off fossil fuels. I genuinely believed that. Like, I genuinely believed that solar and wind were the answer and that we could just place solar panels on people's roofs and kumbaya, we're all solved. Everything was good. But, like, that's just not how the world works. And I don't think that we're making, like, when you're making decisions that are that rushed, you end up really hurting people's livelihoods. And so I don't really care about the goals that we have to meet by 2050 from a, like, 2024 perspective. as much as I do about making sure that we are moving in the right direction step by step, because none of us know how to get to where we need to be by 2050. And the only way to get to where we need to be by 2050 is going to happen step by step. It's not going to happen with these big, like, overhauling policies.
Okay, I'm getting looks that suggest me to get to Q&A. So let me just stop by asking you the following. Let me see if I can distill what you just said into 2 points,
Sure.
and then ask you one more quick question.
Like ChatGPT.
Like Chat, yeah, sure. So I think what you're saying, which with first part, which I agree with and have written about before, is that there are dangers to being rash and to overestimate, just like there are dangers to underestimating what the risk of anything is.
Totally.
There can be dangers to overestimating. So we thought that overpopulation was going to kill everybody in the 60s. That led to eugenic policies, and we didn't have mass starvation from overpopulation. The government in Sri Lanka in 2021 banned synthetic fertilizer because they were scared of they thought that organic was the solution, and they caused a hunger and economic crisis. So we should be careful. And then would the second point be, whatever's true 50 years from now, let's put one foot in front of the other?
Exactly. Because it's like, if you have I think hopefully there are more than one, I hope that I'm not the only hiker in this room. When you're at the bottom of a freaking huge mountain, you're not going to get there by jumping. You gotta move up.
I don't want to get there.
No, yeah, you'd die. Which is literally what's like, we have to start just moving in the right direction, and we're going to make our way up there. We just don't know how yet. Like, we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. And I think that that's something that is hard for people who take the gravity of the science seriously. It's hard for them to understand, and they're always like, well, we need to do all this right now. But what they don't realize is that human ingenuity is pretty damn creative, and we can create some pretty cool things.
That's a perfect segue to my last question before audience Q&A. What is the coolest ingenuity you've come across in all your travels and all the people that you've met?
Sticking on the poop example, I went to Wisconsin, and there was a dairy farm that I went to where they were turning cow poop into natural gas. And of course, the cows are going to poop either way. And so you're using this byproduct to fuel people's homes and fuel people's lives. And they were sending it all over the country. And what I like about that is that, well, one, poop is just like, a funny thing to talk about. But it also is like really cool that you can work with farmers on something that benefits them, because they're going to have this byproduct waste anyways. And then you can also protect the environment at the same time. And I think that there's so many things like that out there. We just got to find them.
Yeah, there was a professor at University of South Florida a couple years ago that I saw give a talk about how he shoveled his own poop into a biogas generator out of his house. And I remember thinking, if this is the solution, we're screwed.
Yeah, no, that's not so cool.
On that note, let's open it up to audience. Ben, maybe if you want to come down and grab the mic. Questions for Benji?
So, generally speaking, the Trump MAGA wing of the Republican Party, they're not necessarily acting in good faith when it comes to climate and environmental issues. But I'm curious what you think of their policies when it comes to climate solutions. Like, is there a room for tariffs, the economic nationalism, anti-immigration policies? Are those useful in the toolkit of the conservative environmentalist?
I would say, that's a really good question. And I would say that, a lot of the conservative principles that I hold maybe are not in line with that. But I think that the America First approach on energy is conducive to a pro-climate approach, because the fact that we use 90% of our 90% of the solar materials and wind materials that we use are coming from China. EV batteries, same thing. The fact that we're exporting all of that to an adversary that doesn't really care about the future of America is a reason to do more of that at home. And I think that sort of America First mindset, not in the Trump way, but just kind of in the actual thought process way of America First, could be conducive with his administration if he had the right people around him, which is something that we're trying to do. But then I would say the other thing is, there's this idea, without getting too much into the weeds, of a carbon border adjustment, where countries with higher carbon emissions would be held accountable through kind of like a tax almost, basically to make it so that they are incentivized or disincentivized from their current behavior, but incentivized to kind of lower their carbon footprint. Because as much as we have contributed to carbon emissions in the past, we are decreasing carbon emission levels faster than any other country. Of course, we have more work to do, but theirs are skyrocketing, right? And so, can we hold those countries accountable? That would be a very pro-Trump thing. But I think one of the things that we have to again do is take this. Like, there are genuine policies that are pro-climate and pro-environment that are conducive with MAGA conservatism and traditional, like, kind of like Mitt Romney conservatism, both. But we have to show those leaders that and have them believe it. And that's part of the problem, is that they don't believe it because it's such a culture war issue. And they're missing out on a whole set of policies that would help the country if they would actually open up their minds to the fact that maybe this issue that's been taken over by the left for the last 20 years that Republicans used to lead on, so maybe there's hypothetically policies that work within their mindset. Maybe. And they have to start believing that. And that's why I think taking this issue out of the culture wars is really critical. It's not going to be an easy feat, but we got to do it because there are beliefs that are conducive with a Trump world.
Just a super quick follow-up question on what you just said. Would it help if academia had more conservative and right-leaning moderate professors to the point,
Those
in this
exist?
climate field?
Oh, wow.
Some of us are Canadians. I've heard some on the left and the right argue that
Right.
it's for climate. That if you had,
I think that would help.
Emmanuel's, those of you who don't know who that is, that's a famous climate scientist who's a registered Republican.
Yep. Yeah, it would really help because people do point out that like all these climate scientists are registered Democrats and like all this stuff, and the science is not inherently partisan, and I know that. And so that's what's frustrating about it, right? Is that people associate it with party, but they're looking for ways to do that. So I think it would help. And I also think like putting out ideas that are inherently conservative for elected officials to see would be really helpful, because what they're seeing right now is maybe more targeted towards like a Harris administration.
Yeah. Question over there.
And then up there.
Thank you. So my question kind of ties back to federal overreach. A lot of environmental policies are kind of grounded in the federal government and aren't necessarily passed with the consent of the states that they affect.
Right.
How do you kind of tie that back into conservatism, which promotes states' rights and limited federal government?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. So I appreciate you asking that. I would say one of the issues that I have with the current environmental movement is that the first resort is the federal government. And I would say that local communities tend to know how to take care of their local communities best. And so I would rather go through the filter of, can the private sector fix this? Can the local communities fix this? Can the state government fix this? And then go to the federal government. And I think to solve these problems, I actually think it would be better for the environment if we put it through that filter. So when you're leaning on the federal government to solve everything, it doesn't necessarily work out very well, because it tends to be one side or the other that makes the policies, and then they're completely leaving the other side, states and communities, outside of the equation, especially in today's hyper-partisan world. And you're relying on like Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC to actually get something done, which is like, impossible, because a lot of these people just care about themselves. So I would say we have to be able to turn the conversation on its head to be able to say, okay, do we need to rely on the federal government for all of this? And the answer is no. And the private sector is making so many, areas of progress. I think one of the reasons why people are so turned off by the environmental movement is because they feel like if the federal government's going to solve it and Democrats are the ones to make the policies, they're going to leave Wyoming, they're going to leave Wisconsin, they're going to, where I grew up, they're going to leave all these flyover states that they call them, like literally behind. And I think there's a lot of reality to that. So my answer would be, one, the people who live in conservative states need to propose their own policies so that they're not left behind. But two, we don't need to just rely on the federal government to solve everything.
Hi, I'm a JD and a master's student studying environment and natural resources, and I hope to write my thesis on critical mineral mining. and the bottleneck that happens with processing because we're totally dependent on China. I totally see my very liberal beliefs totally overlapping with even some MAGA ideas, which I find it very interesting. Two quick things I just want to point out. You did bash on California making some political decisions for their own state, which is a solution to federalism. So sometimes I feel like there's this hypocrisy of saying don't want the federal government, states should be able to be kind of a testing place, but then
Sure.
people like to bash on certain states for doing that test of policymaking. So
Sure, that's fair. Yeah.
thank you. I wanted to know if you knew who Grover Norquist was.
Yeah, he doesn't like me.
No. Well, have you ever thought about Grover Norquist made Republicans sign this pledge that they weren't going to ever raise taxes? And it kind of started this idea that Republicans are just these stalwarts who don't work with Democrats and sign pledges to never raise taxes. Have you ever thought about doing something similar to get Republicans to kind of sign a pledge to say they will work with Democrats or they are willing to work specifically on issues of conservation and environmentalism and energy resources?
Really great question. Yes, I mean, so in the next few months, Hattie, our chief of staff, is in the front, but we're going to be launching an organization called Nature is Nonpartisan, and it's going to be kind of a convening mechanism for elected officials and leaders to basically say we're going to put politics aside and work on solving environmental issues that Americans agree on. Because there's a lot that Americans agree on. Like, Americans do not agree on EV mandates. They do not agree on solar and wind mandates. They don't agree on a whole bunch of things. But they do agree that sustainable agriculture is good. They do agree that forest management is good. They do agree that more American energy and specifically clean energy development in the United States is good. Like, there's a lot of overlap, and our politicians need to realize that. So and work together on it. So I love the idea of that being like a pledge that electeds take. I think it's a really good idea. We were going to basically do that from the grassroots angle to show that like 1 million Americans across the spectrum believe in these things. But I think having electeds do that, it's a great idea. And that's kind of the theme of what the next phase of the work that we're going to be doing is all about. And that's not to say that we're going to agree on everything, because that's not true. But just like there was overlap in the 1980s and 90s, there can be overlap again. So thank you.
Thank you for your presentation and your speech today. I think you've done a great job. You spend a lot of time talking about America as what we need to do here and all the problems that we're facing as bipartisan or even nonpartisan topics. But you've also talked about China as a reference and some of the international expansion. How do you view our problem in the context of a much bigger global problem? And where do you see the potential overlaps of nature as nonpartisan and also with regards to conservative ideals as well as environmentalist support, specifically around supply chain, maybe running into needing to support fossil fuels to just supply power?
Right. Really good questions. I was asked at Congress when I testified there with Greta in 2019, and one of the members of Congress on the right asked, why should we do this? Why should we even pursue lowering carbon emissions in the United States if China and India are going to keep doing what they're doing, and if they're just continually dominating the supply chain for all these things? And my answer was, just because other countries are doing something that we don't like doesn't mean that we shouldn't be moving in the right direction, because throughout history, that would never be a valid excuse to not act in the right direction. But second, if this economy, this kind of a clean-ish, clean energy adjacent economy is going to be the multi-trillion-dollar economy that it already is, but it will continue to be, don't we want to have a massive seat at that table? And also, the best way to get the developing countries to be less dependent on dirtier forms of energy, whether that be burning poop or, having coal power, which is, a reality that most of the world still has, especially the developing world, is to make it affordable to be cleaner. And we have the resources in America and the ingenuity and the smart people to make that happen. And I know you are involved in a lot of really amazing companies that are, some of them might work, some of them might not. But we're gonna have thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of entrepreneurs in this country come up with innovative ideas to solve these problems. And then we can export those ideas to other parts of the world that need more affordable solutions. And that's where I think the United States can lead, is driving down the cost of being pro-environment. And until that happens, these countries aren't going to do it. And so that's where I see our obligation, but I also see it as an opportunity. I don't see it as a negative obligation. I see it as an opportunity.
Just a brief follow-up to that. For the people listening in on the podcast, where can they follow you on your future speaker engagements?
Yeah, so we, I'm on social media at Benji Backer, but Nate, the organization that I started is acc.eco, and then Nature's Nonpartisan will have its own website as well. And so, we're kind of talking about these issues all the time, and you and I work together on a lot of different things. But following us on social media at Benji Backer, which I'll post the Nature's Nonpartisan stuff when it's up. And this is just the beginning of the work, and like the Nature's Nonpartisan movement is going to be not about me or Hattie because we're gonna have some major influencers. It's gonna be about like the bulk of America kind of rallying behind these concepts. And so it's important that you ask that, because I would love to have people kind of be involved in that. Other questions?
Earlier, you mentioned the Rowan Carbon Initiative Act. I don't know, like, off the top of my head, the details of that law, but do you believe that tax incentives, tax subsidies, and taxes, government intervention can be a productive or effective way of addressing carbon emissions?
I think that it is part of the effective strategy. I think it's been leaned on, unfortunately, as the only thing to do. I prefer incentives over regulation, which I wrote about in the book. Is just kind of like, if you make people feel like they're part of the solution, like the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which you referenced, is making farmers feel like they're part of the equation because they get a tax incentive for being pro-climate, instead of like saying, you have to do this, you have to do that. And I tend to favor the incentives over regulations, which there are downsides to all of it. There's downsides to letting the private sector take complete control. There's downsides to regulation, and there's downsides to incentives. To me, there's a balance between all those that needs to be struck. America needs to create the marketplace where it is helpful for people to be pro-environment. It's helpful for people to start businesses around this stuff. It's helpful for farmers and ranchers and energy producers to be cleaner and better. I don't necessarily believe leaning on regulations and taxes is usually the right answer. I see that as kind of the last resort. But again, last resort doesn't mean we don't do it. Last resort just means if the private sector and state governments and other people can't kind of be a part of the solution, that the government is also there to do it. And that's kind of like the fiscal conservative in me. Limited government doesn't mean no government, right? Limited government just means government when it's necessary, when it's helpful. And I think on one side you have, kind of there's this like ignoring of the fact that we have a big environmental impact, and that it's going to basically have a big impact on the rest of our lives. And then the other side, it's basically like, we're going to have this big environmental impact, so we're going to rely on the government to solve everything. And that's not necessarily helpful either. So that's a long way of saying, yes, I think it's part of the solution, but I don't think it's the only solution.
I'm Abdul from Nepal. I want to know that there are three most pressing environmental: climate change and plastic pollution. A lot of problems, including on our Mount Everest also. Himalayas that Nepal has. Right. So are we willing to get for policy? Nepal is having universal resources for the world. That is Mount Everest and the tigers of Nepal and rhinoceros, Asian elephants, all are having problems due to climate change. So are you going to do some positive discrimination for any funding, any support for those countries are in need? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think biodiversity protection is really what drives like the work that I do, and like my love of this issue comes from my love of the physical environment. Like that's what draws me to the issue, and what really pains me is kind of like the destruction of these places, which partially it's climate change, but also it's like the illegal logging and timber stuff in the Amazon is obviously incredibly destructive right now, and of course has a negative climate impact too because you don't have the forests to suck up the carbon. So I think the United States needs to be working at that table, and I don't know what I think that the best thing the United States can do, and I think like as a one-off, I think people, we should be involved in those conversations about supporting countries that need to protect the places that are so important to all of us. But I think again, I do believe that technology and efficiency and ingenuity can solve a lot of these problems, and until it is not economically beneficial to hurt the environment, it will continue to happen. And that's why we cannot innovate and have entrepreneurship in this country and around the world scale fast enough. The thing that gives me the most inspiration is I'm traveling around the country. Uh, like I said, 25 cities in the last 30 days. So many really cool initiatives are happening everywhere, and I know that some of them are going to break through. And I know that we're going to have. I do have a lot of optimism for the future. I do think we're going to bend the curve of emissions. I do think that climate change is going to slow, and I do believe that we're going to reverse the trend. I don't know how that's all going to happen. Even next week, I'm speaking at this, Wyoming Tech Summit in Jackson Hole, where there's just a bunch of companies who are largely working in Wyoming to solve problems with climate change and protecting the environment through innovation and entrepreneurship. And there's billions of dollars being put into these companies around the country, and all over the country, these innovators are doing it. And those things can be scaled to the rest of the world. So I do genuinely believe that we're going to flatline emissions. It's not going to happen this year, but it's going to happen sometime soon. And I do think we're going to bend that curve. But we have to do it to support the biodiversity in this planet, because if that goes away, we go away. That is a real concern. But again, that's a concern, but I have optimism that we'll solve it.
Thank you for taking my question. Thank you both for being here and fostering the discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for the book. I wanted to ask about regulation. So most major environmental regulations
Yeah.
incredibly polarized. No one really likes endangered species, left or the right.
No.
It's ineffective. It's bureaucratic. It's a mess. Having worked in it, it sucks
Yeah.
to work with. Moderate, clean air.
Another really important point, because in the 1980s and 90s, that is a totally different. In 70s, it's a totally different time in American history, and technology has changed, these issues have changed, and to think that that law would be relevant today in the same way that it was back then is really, really bad. And to think that like we got them all right 100% and not going to amend it at all. I mean, we've reduced. I think we've removed 2 to 3% of the endangered species listed. That's a fail in any college class. That's a true F. 2 to 3%. I don't think anyone would ever say that that's a success. So we have to update those things. But I would say the biggest problem is that like politics has become entertainment. It's not about solving problems anymore. And when you look at those sorts of policies, regulatory like updates are not sexy or interesting. And how do you campaign on that? How do you tweet about that? How do you like make a political statement about that? There's a disincentive for politicians to solve these complex problems. And I would say that the best thing we could do is to show politicians that we want them to. And I think on permitting reform, finally, with the National Environmental Policy Act, like that finally is starting to potentially get updated, because you can't build anything in the United States for clean energy without doing that. We need a similar push on the Endangered Species Act and Clean Air Act, Clean Water Acts to update those. And I would say politics being entertainment is the biggest opposition to that. That's why it hasn't happened. You look at like when it probably should have started to be amended 10-ish years ago, 15 years ago, and we were starting to realize what was actually going on. That's when politics started to become different than it was before. And I think advocacy around these complex issues from everyday voters is really critical too, because no member of Congress is hearing from a voter on updating the Endangered Species Act or streamlining NEPA reform. Like that's just not happening. So I think it's partially up to the voters to who know about it, like you and I and others and people in this room, and then it's also up to our legislators to get out of the culture wars and realize that these things have massive ramifications. But I would say that that's one of the most important things we could do to protect the environment is update these outdated laws. And that's the risk of regulation, is that if it doesn't work, it's hard to go back and undo it. And if it does work, but then later starts to not work because it's not relevant, it's also hard to undo it. And we're seeing that with those policies.
So thank you for that question. Thank you all for the questions. It seems like we're at a moment where we don't have time to talk about the details of this, but there's evidence that climate change is becoming an election issue for Republicans, and Republicans are looking for members of their party who can speak to it. Democrats who see the scale of the issue know and recognize that they need Republicans to talk to. You guys are here. Benji Backer, thanks for.
Well, before we go, and I really appreciate everyone being here tonight. You do, I think, have the best governor in the country when it comes to leading on this issue. You might not agree, or you might agree, but in a way that will actually resonate with the majority of the people and the majority of the reality of the economic situation, the environmental situation. The future of American energy does reside in Wyoming. That is 100% the case. And so you're in the best place to be active on this issue. And so I'm going to continue to invest in this state because I firmly believe that it's the most important state from an energy perspective over the next 50 years. And I'm back here again next week. I come here all the time, and I think it's probably the most important university in terms of where in the decades ahead, generating talent for these different industries and initiatives. So it's an honor to be involved here for this, hopefully being step one of many partnerships between our organization, our movement, and the university. But please stay in touch and just know that you're in the right place at the right time, whether that's intentionally or not. And I genuinely mean that. And so excited to continue working with you. And thanks for being here tonight.
Yeah, let's give a round of applause to Benji Backer. Just a quick plug before you all go. I encourage you to look up Grounded Not Divided, the podcast that we're starting. It's on Spotify. It's on Apple. You can find it on my Substack called Guided Civic Revival. And we've got some really cool conversations upcoming with business leaders who have been on both clean energy and fossil fuel companies, education leaders in K-12 and higher ed, pharmaceutical executives, and much more.
Awesome. And yeah, I'll stick around to sign any books if you want to, or also I want to hear about what you're working on, and I can give you my contact information to stay connected. So.
And we hope that you'll tell all your influential friends about the centrality and importance of the University of Wyoming.
Completely.
I'm sure my Dean Bollier would want me to say that.
Absolutely. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.